Hello, my friends. It is a very hot day in July here in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State. So today I'm not wearing my usual Polish cap or Russian peasant shirt or Swiss peasant shirt. So you'll have to pardon me for that. I do have my nice Schatzalp hat on that I usually wear when I am in my role as historian in residence there. So we have a very big topic today as we continue our exploration of Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich's diaries for 1906. And the date today is 9th January 1906, and I should add that these dates are in the old style, meaning that they are on the Julian calendar rather than the Gregorian calendar that most of the rest of the world was already using at that time. And Russia would not change to the Gregorian calendar until after the revolution. So at that time, it was either 13 or 14 days behind the Gregorian calendar. So this would have been, I think, what would it have been? The 22nd or so of January. January, another J month. So before we start with this actual diary entry, you need some very necessary background information about the 1905 revolution in Russia. And there were several things that contributed to it. It was really a foreshadowing of what would happen in 1917. But it was not, I guess you could say it was successful to a certain extent, which we'll talk about later, because there were some changes made, but the government, the monarchy remained intact. So there are two things in the 1905 revolution, just before and just after, I should say, that affected Dmitri and his sister very directly. And one was the assassination of their uncle on 4th February 1905, before the revolution had actually started. And in the old calendar, or in the new calendar, that was 17th February. And prior to the successful assassination of the uncle, Dmitri and Maria had been in a carriage with their uncle, and there was a terrorist waiting to blow up the carriage, but when he saw the two children, he decided that he couldn't go through with it. And so the great French existentialist and writer Albert Camus actually wrote a story about that. And I just now thought of that, and I should have looked it up because I don't remember the title. But anyway, I'm digressing. So the second thing that would affect them directly is that they would be brought with the other members of the imperial family to attend the opening session of the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament, which was a brand new thing and was huge, and something that it was felt that even children of Dmitri and Maria's age needed to be present at. But that, of course, comes much, much later, and that would come in October, and I haven't even read Dmitri's diary entries for that event yet, so it will be very interesting to see what that experience was like for him, and I hope indeed that he does describe that in some detail. So going back to the 1905 revolution, which really got started in October, there were a number of things that fed into it. So the great reforms under Alexander II that had taken place gradually during the second half of the 19th century had been a failure in two very important ways. Even though they had liberated the serfs, who could no longer be bought and sold or compelled to remain on their owners' estates. The peasants were left without what they had wanted, which was the land. They had wanted the land for themselves to farm. And instead of that, they were given the option to buy some of the landowner's land, but it was expensive and it was not enough, and there were other problems. So that was one thing. And another thing was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, in which Russia was defeated, and that was a crushing defeat. Japan had modernized so rapidly that it took Europeans by surprise, that an Asian power could at that time defeat a European power was unthinkable to Europeans at that time. And of course it was humiliating for Russia, and it seemed to show that Russia was a great power in name only, and that it was not meeting the needs of the aspirations that people had at the top and the needs that people had at the bottom, the workers and the peasants. Not the bottom in any value sense, but where they were in the social pecking order. And it also, so the other thing was that the autocracy wasn't reformed. And I think I mentioned that before, that Russia was a true autocracy. It was absolute rule by the emperor. And that was something that in the modern world just wasn't acceptable to people anymore. So it didn't allow for there to be any civil society where educated people and people who were interested in government could have a say in shaping the future of their country. And even some Grand Dukes, like later Dmitri and his cousin Nikolai Mikhailovich, would be very frustrated with that, because they wanted to play a role in the future of their country. And the only way they could do that is the way that anybody else could do it, which is to influence the emperor. And of course they had access to the emperor, unlike other people, but they still couldn't do anything without him allowing it. And neither of them saw eye to eye with Nicholas on what should be done. But that, again, is a digression. I find this so interesting that I'm tempted to talk about it at length. So there were a number of assassinations in advance of the 1905 revolution, and one of them was the Governor General of Moscow, who happened to be Grand Duke Sergei, not only Dmitri's uncle, but the uncle who was raising him, and his sister, and with whom they lived. And Sergei was detested. He was not a popular person. Personality-wise, he was very much a martinet. He even terrorized Dmitri and Marie to some extent, although he could also be very affectionate with them. And so he was hugely unpopular in Moscow because he was a little autocrat there. Nicholas II approved and allowed him to be almost a viceroy there and to rule with an iron fist. And Sergei was also generally not popular within the family because of his sort of humorless and strict personality. So he was assassinated by a group called the Socialist Revolutionaries. And unlike the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, they were an agrarian revolutionary group. So they wanted the revolution to start with the peasants, not with the urban workers, the proletariat, and the factory workers. And in fact, after the revolution, they would actually fight together with the monarchists, with the so-called White Russians, white meaning that they were supporting the Tsar and the idea of a return to monarchy. And the socialist revolutionaries would fight with them, I guess because, you know the old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they had a little terrorist organization at that time. They were playing for very high stakes. They were not holding back from bloodshed. And they assassinated Dmitri and Maria's uncle, Sergei, and that was in February. But by the time that happened, there had already been a very, very, well, I mean, maybe the biggest single event in precipitating the 1905 revolution, and that had taken place not in Moscow where Dmitri and his sister were living, but in St. Petersburg. And it took on the name Bloody Sunday. There are other Bloody Sundays in other countries. In Ireland, for instance, there's a historical event called Bloody Sunday. But this was the Russian Bloody Sunday. And it took place on the 9th of January, 1905. So the diary entry we're reading today is actually the one-year anniversary of that. And so what happened in Bloody Sunday? Well, it was peaceful. So there was a tradition in Russia of people being able to petition the Tsar directly. And in fact, it was an ongoing position. And the Tsar had members of the suite who were called Flügel adjutants. They used the German word. And one of the tasks of those members of the suite, they would take turns being on duty for 24 hours at a time. And one of their main tasks was to receive petitioners and to carefully write down what those petitioners wanted to ask and to pass the relevant ones on to the Tsar. And I've seen some of those carefully recorded petitions, so that really was going on. But this was a mass petitioning, so they were led by a priest called Father Gapon, and they marched to the Winter Palace or walked to the Winter Palace, and there were women and children, and they were loyal. They were presenting themselves as loyal subjects of the Tsar, who were asking for some relief and some changes. And the troops the Tsar actually wasn't there. He was in Tsarskaya Selo, I believe. And the troops opened fire on them, even though they were unarmed and they were peaceful. And it was a horrible massacre, and hundreds of people were killed, maybe up to 1,000. I don't know if they ever knew the exact number. So yes, Bloody Sunday, an apt name. So that was an outrage, and Nicholas II failed to respond to it as an outrage, which made it more of an outrage. So Bloody Sunday I wanted to cover because, interestingly, Dmitri does not mention it. He mentions something else very bloody in relation to the revolution, but he doesn't mention Bloody Sunday, which I find extremely interesting, because he did mention the anniversary of this event with the apparently accidental firing of cannons at the Royal Pavilion during the Theophany celebration. And so he notes, yes, this is the one-year anniversary of that, but he doesn't say anything about Bloody Sunday, which makes me ask, did he know about it? And it seems like it would be impossible for him not to know about it, but it does make me wonder, because he usually didn't hold back, as you'll see in this very diary entry, from talking about the horrible things that happened during the Russian Revolution. So why doesn't he mention it? I don't know. I know that before their uncle's death, he and his sister living in Moscow had been very aware that there were revolutionaries and that there was a certain amount of danger to the Russian imperial family, and that there were people who were very unhappy with their lot in life. So their uncle, Sergei, had actually, oddly enough, met with one of the big labor leaders in Moscow, whose name was Subatov, and he'd not only met with him, but he'd given him a certain amount of support and even walked in a march with him, in a pro-labor march, if you can imagine. So the idea was, I guess, that we can meet the workers halfway and avoid there being an uprising and control it. I mean, that was the most important thing, to have it under control. And Sergei actually took some steps in that direction. But, so, did the children know about that? That I think they did. I really think they did, because later on in his diaries, Dmitri would always be very interested in labor movements and strikes. And I think maybe that went back to what his uncle was doing rather than just what had happened at the time of the revolution. So, yeah, in Dmitri's sister's memoirs, it's clear that they didn't get a lot of information, that information was kept from them, and that they were frustrated by that. And there's even, if I'm remembering correctly, she talks about them, or at least Dmitri, trying to get into their uncle's office and purloin some information, or at least read it so they would know what was going on. She also talks about the fact that she herself was practicing lacing up her boots so that when the revolution happened, or if the revolution happened, she would know how to do that without the help of servants. And yes, it's a bit pathetic to think about a girl of her age not feeling confident in her ability to tie her shoes, basically. But that's what life was like, particularly for girls. In some of the Grand Ducal families, the boys were raised to be, they had servants who were waiting on them on the one hand, but they were also, their fathers wanted them to sleep in camp beds, in cots basically, and to wake up at the crack of dawn and to learn to live like they would be living if they were soldiers on campaign. But that was not the case with Dmitri. That was a more traditional way of raising young Grand Dukes. And that had, at least in his branch of the family, that had died out. That was sort of the previous generation. So the children were aware that there were these revolutionary currents, and they could be dangerous. And then when their uncle was assassinated in the courtyard of his palace in Moscow, while they were in the palace, and when they heard the noise, they ran to the window. And we'll get into all of that, because he will talk about that when we come to February and to his memory of that event. In fact, he'll start talking about it very soon. And where are we? So all of this had been going on, and then another bloody event happened in December of 1905, and while the revolution was in full force. And this had happened in Moscow. So Dmitri and his sister would either have been present in Moscow with their aunt, or they would have been on one of their visits to stay with other relatives in St. Petersburg. He doesn't say which. It seems to me like they probably were in Tsarskaya Selo or St. Petersburg. And so, unlike Bloody Sunday with the peaceful petitioners, this was a serious armed uprising with professional revolutionaries leading and organizing it. And so Dmitri is going to talk about that, because one of the generals, a man by the name of Georgy Alexandrovich Min, will be present at dinner on this occasion, 9th January 1906, when Dmitri is writing his diary entry. And Georgy Alexandrovich Min was the commander of a guards regiment, the Semyonovsky regiment, and his regiment was summoned from St. Petersburg by the Governor General of Moscow, Dubasov, who had requested officially that help be sent to him with this very serious uprising. So the Tsar asked the Semyonovsky regiment to go, led by Min, and Min immediately went on the offensive, and he gave his troops the order. Should I say it in Russian and show you how bad my pronunciation is? Арестование иметь пощады не давать. So that means no arrests, no mercy. And if any of you are Russian and you heard that, you're probably laughing your heads off. No arrests, no mercy. And that's exactly how things unfolded. There was bloodshed. There was a famous labor leader who was killed. There was a famous socialist revolutionary who was killed. Without ever having gone into the details, I don't know how justified that was. I don't know, if it was troops shooting at people who were fighting back with sticks and slingshots, or if they were. I think not. I think they were putting up a real armed resistance. But still, this idea of no arrest, no mercy, yeah, it's harsh. It's very, very harsh. And Nicholas II was quite happy with the result, which probably wasn't good at that time. He might at least have expressed some regret, but instead he promoted General Min to Major General, and he made him a member of the Imperial Suite. So these were big rewards, and insofar as people knew about it, I'm sure they were greatly offended by it. It could have been handled better, to say the least. So, having said all that, let's go to the diary entry itself. So, 9th January 1906. We went to the Alexander Palace for lunch and were almost late because some groom forgot to give the order. In the afternoon, I read with Monsieur Welter, drank tea at home, and will also have dinner at home. I asked Georgy Mikhailovich to let me read War and Peace, but I don't think he will, at least not yet. It seems that Aunt Alex doesn't want us to come for tea. She told us yesterday that it would be more convenient, or rather nicer for them, i.e. Uncle and Aunt, if we came for lunch rather than tea. It follows, then, that they have no desire for us to come to tea. What a joke. So when we arrive at 5 o'clock, the thought will always come to mind that maybe they don't want us at all. Sorry, I just cut the top of my head off. I'm sitting here with a bandage. This has been going on for 5 days now, because I have a swollen gland, and GM says if you walk around without a compress, it will have to be cut out, which would be very unpleasant. From 11 o'clock to 12:30, I took a walk with Monsieur Welter and did some skiing. Monsieur Welter took pictures with a new camera that I gave him. What horrors he describes about Moscow. He was at all the riots. I'm sorry, Min comes. When does Min come? He comes. Did I mention him? This seems to be Welter, who's been in Moscow. So, how did I think that it was Min? Well, never mind. So it was Welter. He was at all the riots, so he saw and heard everything. It's terribly disgusting. For example, he says that on one occasion on Tverskaya, they shot cannons at a small group of people who were standing by a house, and naturally they were all slaughtered. One man was even decapitated by a shell, and then they went to have a look at that place, i.e. they looked at the wall where so much blood had spattered that the whole wall was red. Terribly disgusting. And then he said a lot more. I still haven't written to Aunt, meaning his Aunt Ella back in Moscow. I definitely need to do it tomorrow. So I guess Min wasn't the day before, was he? I guess I'm going to have to figure this out. I'm not going to re-record it because I like the first part Uh-oh, now the neighbor's mowing the lawn or something. Oh well, so it goes. We continue. So, Welter, Monsieur Welter seems to have been pretty much Dmitri's favorite of the various tutors and teachers that came to see him, because he would play with Dmitri, and that may have been part of his role. They went on walks together. I guess you could have called him even a PE teacher, a physical education teacher, because they usually did physical things like skiing and taking walks, and while they were doing those things, while they were doing those things, they were very often playing together. So I guess I'm going to have to cut this short. Very interesting, and we can talk about it next time. We'll return to War and Peace, and we'll return to the idea that Alex and Uncle Nicky didn't want the children at tea, and as Dmitri says, maybe not at all. So, okay. Well, that's a little better, but I'm going to postpone those things anyway because I've gone too long, and I'll also settle the whole Welter thing tomorrow. I have no idea why Welter would have, in Dmitri's words, been at all the riots, so something to think about. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.